How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to Boylai Hobby Time. Today's project will have the channel classic combination of scale Star Wars model kits and blaster bolts frozen in time, using LED filaments, of course. I found this AMT kit online and I bought two of them, but one of them is for a different project that I'll just keep a secret for now. The TIE Fighter, just like my N1s from last week, is in 1:48 scale, which is just about the right size to be paired with a 28mm wargaming miniature, which could be anywhere from 1:48 to 1:56 scale. I haven't had a TIE Fighter in a project of mine in over 3 years now, and I've actually never assembled one larger than 1:144 scale. So I was really looking forward to this one. The kit went together easily with the help of a little super glue when the plastic cement wouldn't cure fast enough. And unlike my usual approach, I did begin the painting of the ship in sub-assembly. The pilot and the interior of the ship would have been nearly impossible to paint otherwise. Not that it really matters in the end, because you won't be able to see them through the windows. But at least we'll all be able to sleep a little better at night knowing that it's been done. After everything was on a painting handle and ready to be painted, I broke out a matte black acrylic primer and my airbrush. Unlike most of the ships in Star Wars, TIE Fighters are usually seen in pristine condition, with essentially no weathering or wear and tear. Which is probably because there's a bajillion of them being made all the time. So I imagine that many of them have actually never seen combat and had a chance to take damage. That, and they also just explode when they're hit once. All that to say, I basically did nothing special with the outside of the ship other than masking off the solar cells and spraying everything a little bit more heavily from above with my TIE Fighter Gray. The pilot, on the other hand, as concealed as he will be, got entirely painted with a brush. In spite of the fact that none of these details will be visible in the end, I decided to take it as an opportunity to paint some subtle highlights on black, something that I don't have much practice with. The interior of the ship got a little bit more life with some red and white buttons. It would have been fun to light all this up with fiber optics, but once again, it would not have really been visible in the end, so probably not worth it. And now that I'm looking back over this footage, I realize there was one thing on the outside of the ship that got painted with a brush, and that was the little blaster tips. It was almost time for assembly, but before doing that, I removed the masking tape, which is of course a very satisfying process. With the ship painted and all the masking tape removed, I could then assemble everything. Regular viewers of the channel will probably have noticed that I'm on a little bit of a Star Wars kick right now. If you're looking for Wild Imaginary West, don't worry, there's plenty more coming very soon. I've just been inspired to do a lot of Star Wars stuff. I'm kind of reliving a lot of my early years on YouTube. Just kind of feeling a lot of nostalgia in the new year. But if you are concerned because you haven't seen as much Wild Imaginary West stuff recently, don't worry. Trains are right around the bend. Hold your horses, cowboy. With the TIE Fighter done, it was time to move on to the hero. Oh, he's starting as a hero, but we might make him a villain. This is an Imperial Assault Mini of Ezra Bridger, who I'm going to convert into Starkiller from the game The Force Unleashed. I have a lot of fond memories playing Star Wars games over the years, but one that probably was the most satisfying from a yielding the Force in an overpowered manner and dominating your opponents kind of way is The Force Unleashed. The character that you play as is called Starkiller. He's a secret apprentice of Darth Vader who has been given the task of hunting down remaining Jedi. Because of your secrecy, and because you're also holding a lightsaber, all the Imperials think that you're not on their side, and you run into a lot of them. So you're essentially everybody's enemy in this game, which means everyone is trying to kill you. But when you have a ridiculous midichlorian count, and no Jedi code to adhere to, and you're not canon, enemies really aren't a problem. After repositioning the arm to be holding the lightsaber in the classic reverse grip pose of Starkiller, I removed some of the details from the chest, and also I removed his hair. Then patched up the seams in the arm with epoxy sculpt, and broke out some thin rods of styrene, which I flattened with pliers to make into all the wraps and belts and straps that are seen on Starkiller's basic loadout outfit. I went with his classic look here, but one of the fun things about the game was all of the different outfits you could unlock, also the ability to change your kyber crystal, which would also change the color of your blade. The Force Unleashed in many ways is similar to a Jedi Fallen Order or Jedi Survivor, but the level of overpoweredness that your character can achieve is what sets it apart. For instance, well, if you're going to play it and you haven't, this is a spoiler alert, there's a moment when you use the Force to pull a Star Destroyer, like a literal city-sized Star Destroyer, out of the sky and crash it into a planet. You can also kill Darth Vader and replace him as Sidious's apprentice. Needless to say, some hardcore fans thought it was a little too much. And I get where they're coming from, you know. On the one hand, you don't want to take away from and minimize the legacy characters. But on the other hand, did you see what I just did to that Star Destroyer? After all the customizations were done on Starkiller, I broke out the airbrush again and primed him black. And rather than using the airbrush to build up the base layers, I chose to do everything this time with the brush. And while I paint this guy, I'd like to give a huge shout out to all of my patrons. This is actually the second project that I've made on my channel inspired by The Force Unleashed. The first one I did a while ago, and I swapped out Starkiller with Luke, where he splits the ATST in two. That's something that Starkiller can do. He actually does a lot of really cool things. The game is just full of these cinematic moments. They just went all out. One of those things, which inspired today's video, is where sometimes there will be TIE fighters flying by, and you can grab them, and just like the Star Destroyer, although not quite the same scale, you can stop them, and you can crash them into the ground. In-game, you can't freeze blaster bolts, like you'd see Kylo Ren do at the beginning of Force Awakens. But I'm just going to go out there and say, I don't think it's a stretch to assume that if Kylo Ren could do it, that my boy Starkiller could do it as well. With that, our hero and our ship were done. Now it's time to combine these two components into a diorama. And for that, of course, we will need a foundation and a base to build on. And this unused diorama base from a dinosaur kit I got a while back is just the right size. The first order of business was to give Starkiller something to stand on. This would help give him some elevation. Another fun element of The Force Unleashed is just the wide variety of landscapes and environments that you navigate through during the game. For this one, I decided on some kind of a wooded planet with some ancient ruins. After cutting out the remnants of a stone arch on my hot wire table, I used a pen to trace out the lines for the stonework. I started with a large brick pattern, then I broke that down into smaller, less perfect stonework. After all the stones had been traced out, I flipped the pen around and began making that a little bit more imperfect, also adding some variety to the depth of the stones. And for the broken edge of the arch, I chipped and peeled that with my fingers. When I got the arch to a place I was happy with, I made a hole in the base beneath where it will sit. I'll run wires through the arch down into the base, so I made sure to create that path now while everything was a little bit more accessible. And if you'll notice, there are actually two holes in the base now, because off camera I had to drill a second one because the first one was incorrect. The next step was to add a mound of foam on the ground where the rest of the arch would have collapsed into a pile on the ground. Then using some foam-safe superglue, I began piling up all the little bricks and stones that I made using more scraps of foam. It's probably not the best approach to this step now that I'm thinking about it. But once all the foam was in place, I broke out some large pebbles, some small pebbles, and sand to fill all the gaps and make the earth and rubble appear a little bit more natural. All of that got soaked in isopropyl alcohol, followed by watered down white glue. The last thing I added to the base before letting it dry was a layer of Mod Podge on the arch. This will dry, create a nice protective shell. And while the base is drying, let's figure out how to suspend this TIE fighter in the air. I bent an acrylic rod with my heat gun, and then I drilled a hole in the side of the TIE fighter that I could embed the rod in. I created a nice sturdy support up top for the ship. I just needed to anchor it in the base to keep it upright. I drilled the hole slightly smaller than it needed to be, but have a nice, snug pressure fit. And then the following day, after all the glue had dried, I added a bit more mud texture from AK Interactive, and then once that was dry, I primed the whole thing with matte black. I followed the black with various woodland floor colors, like green, lighter green, and then a tan, which I overdid as usual, followed by a brown and a green ink to help bring that back to a more reasonable level. And once I was happy with the color of the base, I broke out the wet palette again and hit all the upward facing surfaces and corners of the stones with some highlights. I wrapped up the painting on the base with the most extreme highlights on the top of the arch, and then I moved on to the foliage. Off camera, I played around with some larger plants and grasses, but the higher saturation didn't look quite right for this paint job, so I just went with some flocking and I tried to keep things nice and muted, like the colors on the base already. When that was done, I was pretty happy with the way that it looked. It was finally time to add some lights. Off camera, I threw a little red filament in Star Killer's hands. Then I drilled a hole on the back of the diorama where the battery housing will fit. That's where I installed my toggle switch. The next step was to get the battery housing glued in place and that positive lead attached to the switch. Off camera, I got some wires, very thin wires, relatively inconspicuously attached to Star Killer's lightsaber arm, and then I ran that through the base, and he and the TIE Fighter were ready to be glued in place. For the blaster bolts being fired from the TIE Fighter, I broke out some green filaments, and then I made a little wire rig that would hold them together and supply power to each of the far ends. The setup was a little bit flimsy at first, so I did go back and wrap the filaments and the wires in some clear heat shrink, which did a nice job of firming everything up. And I was of course testing all of my circuits through the whole process. Finally, I drilled one more hole in the TIE Fighter to make a pathway for the wires to travel along the standoff down into the base, where I wired them up to the power supply. I wrapped up all the soldering, made sure those joints were protected with heat shrink, and the last thing to do was to paint the sides of the diorama with black 3.0. And after that, I called it good. That is it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Huge shout out as always to my patrons. You guys are the best. Have an awesome week, everyone. I'll see you next time.